Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome to our next SNARL seminar. And I'll just do a little intro as I see a lot of people are just joining right now. Just to remind everyone that's joining us tonight that we do still have a few openings in some of our kids programs for the summer. So if you're interested in that, please check our website and look under education and outreach. We also have posted some of our Valentine Reserve tours for the summer. So if you're interested in doing some of those walks and talks, we've got topics ranging from geology to wildflowers to bears. So come on out and enjoy Valentine this summer. You can find all the info and the schedule on our website. And many of you know Carol Lester. You feel free to contact Carol too if you have any questions about the programs. And then one final note too is that we're recording all of the seminars. So if you happen to have missed any seminars and you want to go back and see some of those, please just go check out our website. We have the link on our website under the seminar series, but we also have a YouTube channel, the SNARL YouTube channel. And if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, those seminars will pop up there. And then also what's great about subscribing is that then we can get a name for our YouTube channel that has something with SNARL in the name and not a bunch of random letters and numbers that are really hard to remember. So it'd be great if you guys could hit subscribe and then you'll get all those seminars on your YouTube channel. Okay, it looks like we've got a bunch of folks that have just gotten on. So I am, without further ado, since I know everybody wants to get on to the main topic here, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Tom Stevenson is a wildlife biologist, and he's a supervisor with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he's also the program leader for the Sierra Nevada Bighorn Sheep recovery. I know many of you know Tom and are really excited to hear him talk about all the great things that he has going on out here in the Eastern Sierra. He's leading a number of research projects on ungulate nutrition and carnivore demography in the Eastern Sierra. And he has affiliate adjunct faculty appointments with Utah State University and University of Wyoming. Prior to moving to Bishop 20 years ago, he was a wildlife researcher with the Alaska Fish and Game and studied moose and wolf population dynamics. And so Tom today is going to be talking about a subject that is, it's not one with clear-cut answers, as I'm sure Tom is going to talk about today. We chatted about this a little bit, how, you know, it's really difficult to manage nature, and you know, there are endangered species and there are predators, and so you know, thinking about how we manage these species is it's kind of an interesting cross-section of biology and ethics and wildlife management. So today Tom's going to be addressing that subject, and the title of his talk is The Uncomfortable Reality of the Effects of Predators on Endangered Species Recovery. So thanks, Tom, for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate the introduction. I'll go ahead. Well, I'll talk for a minute before I share my screen. Because given the topic, you know, and I figured it would be a topic that might be of interest to some folks. Other folks might not want to hear anything about it, but it is the reality that I certainly deal with as someone who's trying to recover an endangered species, and I know it's a challenging topic for other folks working in endangered species management in some situations. And just to give a little bit more about my background. You know, I consider myself a population biologist, and so consequently, I'm focused on populations rather than just the welfare of individual animals. And so I want to see populations persist and recover, and in particular populations of wildlife species. And I come at it from a background with a strong interest in research background in nutrition. And so I've looked at habitats from a nutritional perspective. And I think that's particularly important when you're trying to assess the effects of predators in a system. And I don't want folks to have the impression that, you know, I'm anti-predator or anything like that, but I've certainly tried to look at them objectively in my career, and by having a nutritional background, I think I'm pretty well equipped to assess whether the effects of a predator are replacing, whether mortality, predation is replacing another source of mortality, or whether it's additive. That's something we talk about in ecology quite a bit, and it's often difficult to assess. But I think, given the types of nutritional data that we've been able to collect on Sierra bighorn in particular, I think we've been able to do that pretty well. So I'll start my presentation. Okay, you should be able to see that okay. Couple photos just illustrating evidence of predation, which doesn't necessarily determine the effect of predation, but I'll get into those details during the presentation. So I came across this paper recently in the peer-reviewed literature, and I've just been thinking about it a lot since I came across it. And you know, I think most of us probably realize that there are a lot of humans on the planet, and they've impacted the planet significantly. But it was interesting to see the estimates that came out of this paper that, and I just threw it up here as a simple pie chart to illustrate the proportion, the amount of biomass of mammals on the planet, and how much of it's humans, how much of it's livestock, and this is specifically mammalian livestock and mostly cattle and pigs. Apparently they're the most numerous. And then wild mammals. And then when you think about ungulates such as bighorn sheep making up just a portion of the wild mammals, it's really pretty shocking. And I think it illustrates, just in a snapshot, how serious the conservation need is for a whole range of species. And, you know, we're fortunate enough in California and in the Sierra Nevada in particular to be working in a system where the habitat is intact. Many endangered species, you know, one of the primary issues is that the habitat's gone or severely depleted. But we have intact habitat, and so we're dealing with some other issues for the most part. In California, I thought I'd start by talking a little bit more about some of the other ungulates in California and how much they've declined, because, you know, I think ungulates often aren't talked about in light of how much they've declined, because, you know, you can feed them and in zoos and, you know, or even in various situations in the wild, provide supplemental feed and have a population. But when you think about it from the standpoint of ecosystem function and what an important species they are or were in many ecosystems, it's pretty alarming when you see statistics like, you know, both tule elk and pronghorn have declined by about 99%, at least based on some estimates. Some estimates are that there were, 500,000 tule elk in the Central Valley. That's a pretty shocking figure. And then you look at bighorn sheep, and while desert bighorn in Southern California have persisted relatively well compared to a lot of other bighorn populations, although we are dealing with some disease issues down there now, they were completely extirpated from Northern California. And just to talk a little bit about diseases and bighorn sheep, bighorn sheep are extremely susceptible to respiratory diseases from domestic sheep. In many ways, it's very analogous to COVID. It's a respiratory disease that's contracted primarily by nose-to-nose contact. Bighorn sheep and domestic sheep are attracted. They're the same genus. They can interbreed. So there's a lot of potential for contact there. And when they overlap ranges, you can end up with entire herds of bighorn dying off. And that's certainly been the pattern across much of the West. Oregon and Washington, for example, lost all of their bighorn sheep historically. And so there've been a lot of efforts by sportsmen and conservationists to reintroduce bighorn populations. And one thing that's unique about Sierra bighorn, just so I don't forget to say it, is that, and California in general, is that we have been able to reestablish our bighorn populations using the native subspecies, the native populations that were adapted to those environments. And I think there's a lot of advantages to doing that in trying to recover an animal. There are some limitations in terms of source stock, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go along. And then I just say, by contrast, there's a lot of focus on mountain lions in California right now. They're actually proposed for listing in some of the coastal populations, particularly in the very urbanized areas like the LA basin, because some of the mountain ranges that they've occupied are, entirely surrounded by urban populations. But over much of the rest of the state, particularly Sierra Nevada and Northern California, lion populations are quite healthy. And, the latest estimate I saw was probably about 4,000 lions in the state. Coyotes, as most people know, are quite abundant. And even bobcats are quite abundant. So I just thought I'd mention that since we're talking about ungulates and predators. So one of the conceptual topics that I wanted to just spend a few minutes on is what's become known as the Extinction Vortex. One of my grad students about 10 years ago, Heather Johnson, did some work looking at population modeling and what factors were the most significant in affecting our ability to recover Sierra bighorn. And as I've talked about, diseases from domestic sheep is a huge one, but that acted primarily, from the time European man arrived up through certainly the 1970s. And the reason I say that is, I'll get to in a second, but so, there would have been a more or less continuous distribution of bighorn. And I'm sure some folks are going to want to debate that with me, but when you look at bighorn habitat in the Sierra Nevada, it's more or less continuous from Alancha Peak in the south to Sonora Pass and even a bit north of that in the north. And there's continuous escape terrain, so big, and as we've studied them over the last 20 years intensively since I've been here, we've learned more and more about where they're distributed and what habitats they'll use. But so domestic sheep arrived with European man, just as far as we know, decimated Sierra bighorn populations. And so we ended up with these small fragmented populations that are particularly susceptible to the effects of predation, severe winters acting on them as well. Those are really the two primary drivers of our populations right now. And when those populations decline, there's a further loss of genetic diversity, and then poor reproduction and poor survival can spiral that population towards extinction. So we're a lot better off than where we were, but I'll explain some of the challenges on this topic as we go along. So Sierra bighorn are alpine specialists. For the most part, they summer up in the alpine above tree line. They're grazers primarily, but they eat forage grasses and shrubs. They, based on, given my interest in nutrition, we've looked a lot at the habitats they're selecting for and have a greater understanding of the degree to which they rely fairly heavily on putting on fat reserves during the summer to make it through winter, or to at least supplement their winter forage. And I've had several grad students looking at this, and postdocs looking at this question in detail, and we've identified a number of different migration behaviors. The one that's most commonly recognized is that bighorn sheep are summering in the alpine and then moving to lower elevations to winter. And then those animals that stay high, and we actually do see some animals that we now term vacillating migrants that move back and forth between low elevation and high elevation winter range. But they're able to stay at high elevations in part because of the fat reserves, because there's not a lot of food up there, but also because when we get snowstorms in the Sierra, they're often followed by high wind events that scour the ridge lines and make it possible for bighorn sheep to live up there. There are trade-offs depending on which strategy an animal selects. And I should also say that the other thing that we understand now is, and I should mention that a lot of our understanding of these behaviors is by capturing bighorn and putting GPS collars on them so that we have a detailed understanding of their movement patterns. But animals that winter at the lower elevations have to be much less concerned about winter severity. There's a lot more forage down low. But there's a much higher risk of predation, whereas animals that are wintering in the alpine have much less risk of predation, but depending on the type of winter, are more vulnerable to avalanches and potentially winter starvation. And this winter is a good example of a winter where it's a good winter to be up high. Snow didn't really accumulate till late January and melts off in many places by March, and so it's pretty easy living up there, and we see that reflected in our survival data. When you look at the historical distribution of Sierra bighorn, as I said, Lanch Peak in the south, Sonora Pass in the north, mostly non-forested areas, or at least the potential to migrate between a non-forested summer range and a non-forested winter range. This area is about 10,000 square kilometers, so pretty sizable historical range. We've got good evidence from historical observations going back to John Muir, and as well as remains, including melting out of glaciers. And a lot of the recovery area includes Sequoia and Kings Canyon and Yosemite. And the other thing I should say is that virtually all of the range of this subspecies is public land, and more than 80% is designated wilderness. So by the mid 1970s, there were three populations left: Sawmill Canyon, Mount Baxter, and Mount Williamson. Sawmill Canyon and Mount Baxter have continued to be two of our larger populations. But at that time, the subspecies distribution had shrunk to these three, and John Wayhausen started working on sheep around that time and has continued to work with us since then. He collected a lot of the early information and was involved in trying to get the animal listed. So shortly after that, my department, as well as a number of state and federal agencies, had been paying attention to Sierra Bighorn. There was interest in trying to, they weren't listed at the time, but there was definitely a conservation concern. And so there was an effort to try to reestablish populations. And so that began in 1979. By 1986, they had reestablished the Mount Langley, the Wheeler Ridge, the Mount Gibbs, and the Mount Warren herds. And I'm going to talk a lot, I'm going to talk quite a bit about the Sawmill Canyon, the Mount Baxter, and the Mount Langley today, in particular Mount Langley. Just for reference. So we've moved a lot of sheep around from a lot of different herds, but as I said, all the Bighorn in the Sierra originated from these Sierra Bighorn populations. We only had 4 source herds, which are what we call the herds that we use as translocation stock, because they've been the biggest. They've been large enough that we could remove some animals for translocation. We've had strict guidelines on how many animals we would remove and when and from where, and done a lot of population modeling to try to ensure that we weren't going to threaten populations. And the most we'd ever remove from any one herd was 10 females, and we would have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 females or more if we were going to remove that many. And so we haven't been able to do that very often. But we've been able to do it enough that we were able to establish all the herds that were considered essential for recovery in the recovery plan for Sierra Bighorn. And so you'll notice that I'll explain that the last reintroduction in 1988, they fully expected that they would be moving sheep over to the Kern unit shortly after that, which is Big Arroyo and Laurel Creek. And it ended up being 25 years before we were able to reintroduce Bighorn over to the Kern. And that was in large part because the population had declined in the Sawmill and Baxter herds in the late 80s and early 90s. And just as an anecdote, I ran into James Wilson sometime probably a year after we had started moving sheep over to the Kern. And it was pretty interesting to see how emotional he was about that, because he had wanted to see that, as someone who'd spent a lot of time in the Sierra and was involved in the recovery effort as a stakeholder. It was really exciting for him to see that we were finally making that happen. So following the listing in 1999, the population increased rather steadily. We had some lulls in there, but things were looking pretty good. And actually by 2016, 2015, we were thinking, that wow, if we kept growing at this rate, we might actually be on track to downlist this animal. But then the winter of 16-17 hit, which was one of the more severe winters we've had in quite some time. And it wasn't just the amount of snow, but it was how much snow we got in a relatively continued during a relatively continuous period with not as much wind scouring. So bighorn sheep that were wintering up high were having to deal with tremendous amounts of snow and not as much ability, at least in some herds, to move into wind scoured areas, and a lot of avalanches too that killed sheep that winter. And then we also had predation on top of it, so that knocked some of our populations back quite a bit. Just in the last year, it looks like things may be turning around a bit. We've had some pretty good lamb survival last year, so we're keeping our fingers crossed. And actually, I should say that these dry winters, while they might not be good for a lot of the state, they actually seem to be pretty beneficial to cedar bighorn because we don't experience those snow-related losses. I wanted to just present one more map that shows the different herd units, and in this case, they're broken down by recovery unit. The recovery plan identifies 4 recovery units, and recovery goals are based on these recovery units. The recovery goals are in terms of adult and yearling females as well, which I meant to mention on that last graph, that those were the numbers of adult and yearling females. So a lot of our work focuses on trying to count and look at the demographic rates associated with adult and yearling females. They're the segment of the population that really determines whether we're growing or declining. So you'll see here that the population as a whole is distributed disproportionately within the Southern Recovery Unit. That's the blue here. It's a larger recovery unit. It has more herds. They also tend to be lower elevation winter ranges, so there's less effective severe winters there. The green one here is the Central Recovery Unit. It has a Wheeler Ridge herd, which is one of our larger herds and productive. And then you'll notice, so the kern here was just reintroduced in 2014, so it hasn't had that much time. The Northern Recovery Unit, was reintroduced all the way back in 86 and 88, but it has had its ups and downs. And I think one thing that I certainly recognize in looking back at the data over these years is that when you completely lose animals from a landscape and then have to reestablish naive animals to that landscape, there's a substantial learning curve there. And you really watch evolution play out where you're putting animals into this new environment and they've got to figure out where to winter, where to summer, and the ones that are able to, will survive and reproduce. And and sometimes they're able to do that for a while, and then maybe that severe winter comes along or some lion predation comes along and knocks them back a bit. But certainly all of those herds that we reintroduced back in the 70s and 80s, and when I say we, the profession, because I've only been on the scene for about 20 years, but when you look at how long all of those have taken to, there's consistently been a period of 10, 15 years, sometimes longer, for populations to really gain a foothold and start growing. So I think it's not unreasonable to think that it takes decades to restore these species. And in many cases, I think we're able to restore the easy ones the quickest. And by easy, if the winter range and summer range are really connected, There's not a lot of forest between them. It's pretty easy for them to figure it out. But and certainly when you look at bighorn populations across the western US, some migrate 60 miles and travel through a lot of forest, and it takes a lot more trial and error to figure that out. So I think this table kind of summarizes a bit of the situation that we're in and we need to be concerned about, in that 6 of our 14 herds have fewer than 10 females, and several of those have fewer than 5. And, this is in part because of severe winter effects and predation in some cases. And when a population gets that small, you can really think about how that extinction vortex would operate at the herd level, where it doesn't take much predation on either adults or lambs, or you lose a few in an avalanche. You could lose all of them in an avalanche when they're that small. So that's one of the realities that we're dealing with and trying to recognize that we need to do everything we can to try to recover this animal. I've talked about severe winters and the effects and the challenges that they pose. But that's one threat that there's not much we can do to manage. It's and it's a bit disconcerting if we think about the possibility that with climate change, severe winters could be more frequent, or more severe. I mentioned dry winters are potentially beneficial, but at least while the population is relatively small. But when these really heavy snow events appear, it can be difficult for the populations. But one thing that's interesting about the effects of severe winters is the convict herd, which is just north of Wheeler. It's in the Central Recovery Unit. It originated with some immigrants that came from the Wheeler herd. A couple things I want to point out here, just for folks that don't look at survival graphs a lot, is we're looking at 0 to 1 represents the proportion that survive, and so if we're talking in percentages, 0 to 100%, 90% survival, I have this dotted line to represent the level of survival, and this is for adult and yearling females, adult females in particular. And based on the population modeling we've done and collecting a lot of demographic data over the years, we have a pretty good understanding that when survival is above 90%, the population's probably growing. When it's much below 90%, it's declining. And when you factor in that we're able to make these calculations based on what we know about average survival rates and average reproductive rates and lamb survival, and the fact that ewes only have 1 lamb and they routinely don't succeed in recruiting a lamb or having that lamb survive every year. So, but what we see in this example is that you have this severe winter event, and this is what we've observed, is knocked that population way back. There was a lot of mortality related to avalanches in severe winter. But interestingly, it rebounded and it's doing quite well again. So you have these severe winter events and they'll knock that population back, but the effects, there might be some lingering effect on condition that persists for a year or so, maybe poor recruitment for a year, but then, we seem to be bouncing right back. And so has a different effect on the population over the long term, especially if they occur relatively infrequently. So the other primary threats that I'm going to focus on, and particularly predation in detail, are identified in the recovery plan as really the two primary threats to recovery. And they're two that we've worked hard to try to manage. A lot of our efforts, we've put a tremendous amount of effort since listing in trying to assess the disease risk and manage it. As I said, we don't have evidence of active disease, and we haven't since the 70s, and that's extremely unusual for bighorn populations in the West because almost everywhere they're coming into contact with domestic sheep. And so we've worked extremely hard to try to assess that risk using habitat models that incorporate habitat selection and cost distance modeling. And that's what this polygon, this black polygon here represents, is where we, based on, over 1 million GPS data points, what we know about the types of habitats that bighorn prefer and where they're likely to travel, and where this polygon overlaps with domestic sheep allotments. So the red polygons are allotments that we've been able to work with land managers to close or vacate. We've also, fortunately, we don't have a lot of private land in the Eastern Sierra, but we've also worked with private landowners to try to come up with alternatives to grazing domestic sheep and goats. They're also a concern in proximity to our occupied bighorn herds, which are the gray polygons on here. So, we put a tremendous amount of effort into it, and we take it very seriously, but it is, the most existential threat to Sierra bighorn, because if a disease showed up in the population, it would have the potential to spread through the population, and we could lose a lot of herds. So it factors heavily into our management. And then moving on to this question of predation and why it's a problem, what evidence we have for it being a problem. But I thought I'd start that discussion with a summary of just ones that I more or less came up with off the top of my head that I know about and have either read about or talked to folks who've worked on these projects. But as you can see, there's a range of species here across a range of taxa that are threatened by a native predator. And in pretty much all these cases, there has been varying levels of management to try and restore these populations. And these are by and large relatively common predators, at least in the environment where they've been problematic. And especially when you get up to some of these larger, more charismatic species, you can imagine that there's a lot of pushback in some cases, and it's difficult for people to understand, and people can't understand, well, how can these predators possibly be a problem because these other species evolved with them. But when you end up in these very small fragmented populations, there's just a completely different dynamic and a real potential for these predators to suppress these prey species, and particularly if they're more numerous than maybe they were historically, either because there's a landfill feeding them, or there's livestock on the range at levels much higher than native ungulates would have been. So there's a lot of reasons behind why they can become a problem. So when you're going to talk about mountain lions and bighorn sheep in the Sierra, you have to also talk about mule deer, because they're the most numerous prey item on the landscape. Mule deer are a species that are still very abundant on the landscape and have done well in the presence of humans. So when you look at Round Valley and Wheeler Ridge. Mule deer winter along the base of the Sierra. They're using those lower elevations. In the Wheeler Round Valley system, you're talking 2,000 to 3,000 mule deer. And you can't tell this based on all these GPS points, but 100 bighorn sheep. Obviously, we don't have every animal collared out there, so this is just meant to be a representation of their overall pattern of habitat selection. Bighorn sheep prefer that steep, rugged terrain. They need it to avoid predators. They're adapted to it. And then you throw a few mountain lions on there. And for the most part, over the years in the Round Valley system, we've seen, we see some mountain lion predation on bighorn sheep, but it hasn't, really knocked the population back substantially. Some years better than others for the bighorn, but for the most part, these lions are preying on deer. When you look down at Baxter Sawmill, the blue dots again are bighorn sheep. I don't show any deer here. And then the yellow dots are actually the points from a single mountain lion that we've seen in recent years that has really keyed in on bighorn sheep. We typically haven't seen that much evidence of a lion having its home range entirely encompass bighorn and not deer. This animal certainly was a bighorn specialist. It certainly came out periodically and ate some deer, but it really it occurred at a time when the lion population is at the highest we've seen it, and when there were other lions using these lower elevation habitats, and it appeared to have had to select a home range in order to avoid overlapping with those other lions that was really up in bighorn habitat. And it's the sort of thing we would never, without having both the lion and the sheep GPS collar, it would have been extremely difficult to observe and detect this. So that lion, these red X's represent bighorn kills. Killed a lot of bighorn sheep. And that's, one of the things that we're understanding is with all of this GPS data is, what are the spatial patterns of habitat use by bighorn and lions that lead to cases where we see higher levels of predation. So this Baxter herd has experienced lion predation before. It was actually back in the 90s when John Weyhausen wrote about it, and lions were certainly appeared to be one of the primary reasons why translocation stock wasn't available. And that's one of the things I may not have talked enough about at the beginning of this presentation, is just how important translocation stock is in getting to recovery. If we're going to augment these small populations, we need to have bighorn populations that are large enough that we can pull some animals out of them to either reintroduce or, for the most part, now augment existing populations in the Sierra Nevada to get them to a point where they're, able to withstand a variety of threats. So, this had happened back in the 90s. About 2008, we really started to see a spike in predation in the Baxter herd. We were able to remove some lions. As you can see, survival jumped back up to 100% for a while there. And that period from 2013 to 2015 was when we were really able to reestablish the populations, the herds that we needed to meet the geographic recovery goals. And it wouldn't have been possible if we had had lions continuing to knock these source populations down. In recent years, we've had another spike in lion predation, and one of the things we've been evaluating as we've removed lions is relocating lions and trying to determine. There's not much literature out there on how lions do when you move them. So we've been evaluating that. Some cases it's successful, particularly with younger animals, and in some cases females. But we're still learning, how effective that can be. So the Mount Langley herd was a herd that has been one of our best performers up through 2015. It's one of the 4 that we used for translocation stock. So we were able to remove animals and it would bounce back. And then in the winter of 16-17, we had a real, it was that severe winter, but since most of these animals were wintering down low, they're avoiding that real heavy snow. But we saw a big spike in predation that year. And this is, none of our herds are that big, but this was one of the bigger ones, 60 females at its peak. And, these are our minimum counts, but we do all of our counts from the ground and we feel pretty confident about these numbers. And they're a minimum at any rate. So we're able to be relatively conservative in our management. So that population declined. And when you look at the spike in lion predation in that winter of 16-17, it doesn't seem like maybe that many animals to some folks, but when you're talking about, and this is what we were able to document, so there could have been some additional predation that we didn't document in terms of finding kills. But it's a substantial effect on that population. And then we also continued to see some additional predation beyond that spike. So in contrast to the severe winter, where you have this severe effect and the population is able to bounce back, in this case, we continue to have lion predation just, and when the population declines to 20 animals and you lose 2, right there, you're at 90% survival, and any other mortality on top of that, you're in a declining stage. And so now we have 17 animals in that herd. So it's no longer in that category that we can consider the source population. We were able to remove some lions, but not all of them, and they were able to keep picking away at the population. One of the other things we've been interested in, and other folks have as well, is what effect does removing lions have on the population? These bars represent lions that were removed, and this is just in the Southern Recovery Unit. So we were able to remove enough lions that we were able to hold that population down, allow the Sierra sheep population in the Southern Recovery Unit to grow, and then it bounced back quickly. So, in the Eastern Sierra, we have a lot of adjacent lion populations, and as well as lions moving up and down the valley. So they're able to repopulate and reproduce pretty quickly to bounce back. And currently we're seeing the largest lion population in the Eastern Sierra that we've documented in probably 30 years of study here. So they're relatively abundant. One last way to take a look at what the effect has been at Mount Langley is how long it's going to take a population to recover. And one of the variables that we're able to calculate is the instantaneous growth rate. And at these levels, it roughly represents, 0.02 is roughly about a 2% increase per year. 0.2 is roughly going to be about 20%. Just as a to give folks some sort of a guide if they're not familiar with these values, but and these are in the range of what we've seen. 0.2 is at the very high end, and it doesn't typically go on for many years. If we're lucky, we're at 0.1, but in many cases, our populations grow at those slower rates. They're dealing, even if you manage lion predation, you'd still have, coyotes and bobcats and golden eagles eating lambs. You'd have, other factors leading to mortality. So if we're able to stop the decline, and in particular by managing lion predation, we're still potentially looking at decades for that population to bounce from 17 to 40. And that's why it's so difficult when we put so much work into it, and to see how quickly it can happen. So yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, if we want to escape this extinction vortex and try to get to recovery, we're really looking at, in the long term, continuing to manage the domestic sheep and evaluate that risk and prevent contact with bighorn sheep. We need to protect the translocation stock by removing mountain lions where possible. And then finally, by doing that, we'll have the source stock to be able to augment these small populations and promote population growth and ensure that we don't lose further genetic diversity. I just want to acknowledge, this has been an interagency effort with support in a variety of ways from a number of other agencies as well as NGOs. And I wanted to put up the names of I think all my current staff that are involved with this. I hope I didn't forget anybody, but John still works with us when he has time, and he's still a valuable contributor to the effort, but I've got a lot of great people working for me, and so I want to do it. And if you want to learn more about Sierra Bighorn, we have a lot of information on our department website. So if you Google Sierra Bighorn and look for the Department of Fish and Wildlife pages, we have all of our publications as well as a lot of information on there that's geared towards the public. So with that, I'll take questions if there's time.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And I think we'll invite our attendees to submit any questions you have in the Q&A box, and I'll pass those along to Tom. And just while people are getting their questions in, I wanted to start out with just one that I was thinking about while I was watching your presentation is the dynamics of those three different populations. You were talking about the mule deer, the mountain lions, and the sheep. And do you see that there are sort of mirrored dynamics between some of these populations where the mountain lions are sort of moving up and preying on the bighorn sheep and then coming down, hitting mule deer? Do you see that the dynamics of the mountain lion populations are mirroring that of the bighorn sheep?
Well, so one thing, and this may get at part of what you're asking. It's been really difficult to predict when we would see these predation episodes. Some of it's potentially a functional response where bighorn populations, as they increase in size, it's more worth it to a lion to prey on them. One of my former grad students did some work on apparent competition, which suggests that where we would have an expectation that we would see heavier predation in bighorn populations that were adjacent to deer populations. And it looked like that was the case for some period of time. And interestingly, Mount Langley is a herd that doesn't that's not immediately adjacent to a large deer winter range. Most of the deer in the valley down there are to the north, so you don't have a lot of deer living right there next to the herd with lions moving back and forth between deer and sheep so much. But that winter of 16-17 was kind of the perfect storm from a number of standpoints, including the predation one, where I think what deer may have been there were forced further away from the herd. There were enough deer there to serve as a prey base for the lions there. And, it was really kind of unexpected, but it certainly highlighted how we still had a lot more to learn. And, one thing I've said is that as tough as it was to see this, winter like 16-17 with this combination of factors affecting the population, I'm glad it happened before they were delisted, and because it just has furthered our understanding of the dynamics and how complex they are.
So I'll start. There's a bunch of questions rolling in, and I'll just start throwing them your way, Tom. Barry asks, how does mountain lion abundance affect coyote and potentially fox abundance?
Well, we have some of our lions that live in places, particularly in the winter without a lot of other prey, make a pretty good living off of coyotes at times. So lions are definitely out there eating coyotes because they are fairly abundant on the landscape. Because they're so, they have a high reproductive rate. So I think they bounce back pretty quickly, even when lions are taking them. Foxes, I think, as much as anything, lion kills probably benefit foxes by providing a scavenging resource. So I don't think we see as much evidence of lions negatively affecting foxes.
Mm-hmm. So, and Scott asks, how do you remove mountain lions? And if they come back so quickly, do you have to just keep removing them constantly?
So we lethally remove them at times. That's certainly how we've removed them in the past, for much of the past. And there's actually a provision in Fish and Game Code specifically for bighorn sheep that gives us the authority to lethally take mountain lions that are threatening bighorn sheep populations. As I alluded to, in the last year or so, we've actually put some effort into relocating them as an alternative. And that's challenging because we need to be able to move them far enough. We're only moving them within the state and actually within our region, which our region actually extends from Topaz Lake down to the Mexican border. So it's a pretty sizable region, but we've tried to put them in habitats where there are deer and hope that they don't come back. Adult males have proved to be particularly challenging because they want to come back. When we move juveniles that are potentially likely to disperse, I think they're more likely to be able to establish a new home range.
Mm-hmm. And then one follow-up on that, kind of getting at this issue we spoke of initially, is because these predators and prey are all native species. It comes down to a bit of a value judgment about what to protect or what to recover. And what's the criteria that Fish and Wildlife might use, or what you might use for making that decision? And is it based on rarity? And so how are those decisions made?
Well, I think rarity is certainly a factor. But I think it also, if you're able to look at it objectively, it also has to do with, and as I talked about at the beginning, as a population biologist trying to restore populations. And we know that, and there's other examples in other states with bighorn sheep where, the reality is that if you're dealing with an endangered bighorn population, and you can remove lions to a point where you can really facilitate growth in the sheep population, you'll be able to, the goal has always been to try to get Sierra sheep listed and then ideally not have to do much management. And certainly from the standpoint of, there's a lot of reasons why and the Fish and Wildlife Service, since these are federally listed, really pushes us to try to get endangered species delisted as quickly as possible. If we didn't have to be as concerned with the politics and could just get them recovered, it would benefit the sheep population from the standpoint of losing a lot less genetic diversity. It would be far less expensive, and that ideally those funds could go towards recovering other endangered species, of which there's many in California. And recovering bighorn sheep is a particularly expensive one because of the scale of the project, the type of work we're doing. So yeah, it's a situation where there's really difficult choices that factor into how we move forward.
So, and then following up on that, Peggy asks, since the mountain lion population in Los Angeles is declining, does it make sense to translocate the Sierra mountain lions to that area?
That's something that we've been very interested in doing. And there's been some pushback on that. There's been some reluctance to do that. And there's a variety, I think some folks are concerned that, and I get this, that if the perception is that we can just move lions in to solve their problem, then there's not going to be as much interest in doing things like putting overpasses in. That's one of the concerns that's been raised. I think there's different perceptions as to the level of genetic uniqueness of lions in those populations as well. So that's been, there's been, some questions raised about that. There's always questions about moving wildlife around from a disease perspective. But I think it's something that's definitely part of the discussion, and we would certainly be interested in doing it if the other folks working in those systems thought that it would be beneficial. And certainly, there's certainly some evidence in the literature to suggest that moving animals in, since one of the concerns is genetic diversity, could benefit those populations.
Mm-hmm. So Tom, I'm just going to get, we're running a little short on time, but there's so many questions here. And I'm going to try to pick out just a couple more, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I'll let you pick them because I'm not trying to read them all.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of great questions out there, everyone. But one that came in that's interesting too, because I've heard about this from our snow scientist here at SNARL about avalanches taking out bighorn sheep too, is can you talk more about the snow effect? And this person says, in a paper I see snow also acts as water supply. In the dry winter, the nutrition level, leaf quantity decreases. The bighorn sheep may not have enough food supplies when there's not enough snow. So it seems like the snow issue, the drought snow issue, has maybe some effects on diet, and then obviously the avalanche effects too. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about the effects of these big winters on the sheep.
Well, certainly snow is important for forage quality for bighorn sheep. But because the population's still relatively small, there's less competition for forage even during dry years. So, you know, and certainly one thing that we see is that, you know, like, for example, one effect you might see relative to the amount of moisture in forage at lower elevations is it is going to affect the condition of a ewe and her ability to successfully raise a lamb. And so, you know, during dry years, we might see poor lamb survival because they're not producing as much milk. During heavy snow years where ewes have depleted their fat reserves, we might also see poor survival. So there's kind of that sweet spot in the middle, I think. But as long as a ewe is able to survive from one year to the next, then she's able to at least have the potential to raise young in multiple years.
All right, and one final question here that I'm going to end on, because I think this is a nice sort of way to think about this, is from Sally, asking, what can the public do to support the SNARL Bighorn Recovery Program?
Well, certainly, I think express their support to whether it's legislators or folks in my agency, you know, try to get the word out about SNARL Bighorn. And I should probably be careful about, as a state employee, telling people to contact a legislator, but I think it's you know, there's certainly organizations out there that support the recovery effort as well. I think the more people that are out there enjoying seeing bighorn and spreading the understanding about SNARL Bighorn, and even, you know, having discussions about some of these difficult topics that I'm talking about tonight, I think all of those benefit the recovery effort.
So one last question I'm just going to have to ask, because you're our wildlife expert, is there's been a lot of talk in the Eastern Sierra recently about some wolf sightings, and I'm going to throw you out on a limb here to talk a little bit about that, if you might. And you know what, wolves are predators, right? And so how do you anticipate if the wolf populations are to be increasing in this area, that they might factor into this whole story?
Well, I had actually thought about including some discussion of that with this presentation, but it would have had to go on for 2 hours. So I didn't think I had time. It's a topic that I've actually been interested in, you know, ever since I used to do some wolf work in Alaska, you know, so I have a decent background in understanding wolf biology, and I figured as soon as they showed up in Northern California that it was just going to be a matter of time before they got here. It's actually taken them a little longer than I thought it would, and I think it's been more challenging for wolves to get established in California than maybe I thought it would be. But and it's kind of been interesting, you know, when it happened and that wolf showed up in Mono County this spring, a lot of folks were pretty surprised. And I think historically wolves would have showed up in the Eastern Sierra periodically, and if there was something to eat, they would have stayed. And they're not, wolves for the most part aren't going to be a very effective predator on bighorn sheep. So they would actually potentially, the presence of wolves could be beneficial to bighorn sheep because they're going to negatively affect the deer population to some degree, and they're also negatively going to affect the lion population because they'll kill and eat both given the chance, and particularly young mountain lions. So there's enough work out of places like Yellowstone that illustrate that. So I think it's going to happen, and it's going to be interesting to watch it play out and see how it affects the dynamics of a whole range of species. Coyotes. I hope I'm around to watch it play out.
All right, so this will be the next 20 years of your research career.
Yeah, exactly. I'll keep me from retiring.
Wolves will be the next species on the graphs you see 20 years from now in our next SNARL talk.
We do some really extensive deer work in the Eastern Sierra, and we have interest in deer for a number of reasons, but that's one of them, as well as I want to have a good baseline on what our deer population looks like, and see how it changes over time, and particularly if wolves show up, how those deer populations respond to the presence of wolves.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Tom. And we really appreciate your talk and your insights. And thanks everyone out there for tuning in. And I apologize if we didn't get to your questions. There are lots, but we'll try to capture those. And hope you guys all tune in next week. We're going to have Roland Knapp here with some of the very first under ice observations in the Sierra Alpine Lakes. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Yeah.